Welcome to people that are joining online. Welcome to people that are joining us in person. We're excited to have you here today for this really special panel. We have 7 instructors here that are going to be sharing their perspectives on managing information literacy, misinformation, and democracy in the classroom. I'll be moderating the panel today, and then we also have Kate going to be moderating our online questions and Kelsey moderating in-person questions. If you do have questions throughout the panel, feel free to leave those in the Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom panel. And then if you have any other comments, questions, thoughts, you can put that in the chat section as well. So I'll go ahead and get us started on our introductions. My name is Sam Mahoney. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I work for the Center for the Advancement of Teaching and Learning, and I'm going to be moderating our session today. And then we'll take it over to Preston. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, I am Dr. Preston Cherry. Happy to be here. I am teaching in the Kaufman School of Business. I'm the head of the financial planning department and teach personal financial planning. So that's what I do.
Thanks, Preston. And now we'll go to Kristen.
Hi, I am Dr. Kristen DePau. I'm an associate professor in education. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And my area of emphasis is culturally responsive, culturally sustaining pedagogy and critical race studies in education.
Thanks, Kristen. We'll go to Lisa next.
Hello, I am newly Dr. I get to say that now. Lisa Lamson, and I'm a lecturer in history and humanities. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And my content focus is largely African-American history as I teach both the introduction and the topics upper level African-American history course.
Thanks, Lisa. JP, you're up next.
Hello, my name is JP Leary. I'm an associate professor in First Nation Studies, History, and Humanities. And I'll be talking about some things that I do in First Nation Studies intro course, Intro to the Tribal World.
Thanks, JP. Brian, we're over to you.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Brian Merkel. I'm the chair of human biology. And I think my connection with this group and what we're doing today is 37 years of personal and professional interest in public health. Great to be with all of you.
Thanks, Brian. We're over to Valerie now.
Hi, I'm Dr. Valerie Marinas-Pillmeyer, and I am an associate professor of English, Women's and Gender Sexuality Studies and Humanities, and my research area is trauma theory.
Thanks, Val. And then last but not least, Jessica.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Jessica Warwick. I'm a lecturer in the natural and applied sciences primarily. I'm going to be speaking about my experiences in my entry-level environmental science class.
All right, thank you, everyone. So we'll go ahead and get started now with the portion where each of our instructors is going to be answering kind of our principal question, which is what strategies or methods have been particularly effective in dispelling misinformation and student misconceptions in your course? And if you want to kind of review that question so you know what we're talking about, Kate has just put that in chat as well. So we'll start with Preston. You have 5 minutes.
Wow. All right. Leading off. Yeah, that's always the tough part. Okay. Well, it depends. It depends on where the, where the question is coming from, as far as the, misinformation. Is it happening, in real time, or am I trying to draw it out? And usually, I have some experience with trying to draw out the misinformation. So I try to kind of head it off at the path a little bit, and try to make ease of the information. So maybe try to make it light, maybe to draw out maybe some comments from the audience. That way it makes it a little bit easier for the participants to say, oh, okay, I may have heard of this, may have heard of that. My area of expertise is, financial planning. People tend to have different experiences with money. It's emotional. It can be. It's cross-generational. in my classes, it could range from young teens, 19, 20, all the way until 60. People from different cultural backgrounds, experiences, ages, marital relations. I mean, you name it, religious backgrounds. So, money just has its different, personal relations. That said, social backgrounds or influences, environmental. I mean, there's so many ways. So, for instance, one of the topics that is here recent was Social Security is going to run out in 2032. I mean, we're going to go broke, right? So I kind of head that off at the path with with a little joke, and so I try to introduce some humor and that, and somebody may say, I heard of that too, and so that Social Security going broke is anxious for some, worries for some, stressful for some. And that is a lot of misinformation, and that affects many households across the country. So, with that, I bring up some information on the screen and try to find a neutral source and introduce that. And then I offer the class of, okay, let's talk about it, right? And maybe the class may say, okay, yeah, I've heard of that too. I just heard of that, right? So maybe use some humor, some I've used a neutral source of information. I've pulled it up in real time and offer up the platform that way. Secondly, some misinformation may be emotionally charged, and it may come out a different way where I didn't control the environment, and it may be emotionally charged and somebody just may yell something out, and that's a little different. And so I may have to let that person, unpack that a little bit. I may ask that person, okay, well, can you unpack that a little bit? And, where you get the information, and let that person share a little bit. And not too much, because I don't want them overtaking the class. And then I'll let another person say, okay, well, does anybody else have another perspective? And then I will then offer up kind of what I did with the first time, which is, okay, let's go to the tape, so to speak. And I may go to the computer right there, and let's offer up some neutral information. But I actually acknowledge both persons in the classroom. The person that offer up the information, the emotionally charged information right there, acknowledge that person. This is a safe place. Okay. I do want to acknowledge that person. I don't want to dismiss that person. I want the person to feel safe and acknowledged and all of that. So we can have a critical conversation, but also a productive conversation as well, because we are trying to elevate and provide an opportunity for all people to be heard, but also introduce introduce an environment for the correct information to be heard. And I'm not sure if I'm at time or not, but I want to just pause right there.
That was great. Thanks, Preston. Okay, Kristen, you are up next.
Well, for me, I try to think about it first by starting with a sense of why people are engaging information in this particular way, and to think about it at a societal as well as an individual level. I think at the root of a lot of this tension is a lot of mistrust and a sense of not having one's knowledge or experience validated in formal settings. And so how I try and start it off is to really just think about why it might be valid for someone to approach information this way. What have been their prior opportunities to learn? And what kind of opportunities for trusting expertise have been provided? And is that valid to not have complete trust and expertise? It may be in some situations. So what I try to do is really help students identify and manage the emotionality around information and the politics around information, and to name that, make it explicit, and really work through what it does and provide them with the tools to interrupt it and talk about it. And I try to do that in a respectful way, because I also need to understand that I can't assume that my students trust me either, or the information that I provide. And I should understand that curriculum is another form of information that is politically loaded, that may not be accurate, and that they are right to ask those questions. But what I want them to understand is the difference between critical thinking and cynicism, and to know the difference. And so we start to work through that as well in terms of skill building with really basic things. I teach in education, and so sometimes translating it to what they can do for their students allows them the emotional distance to kind of watch it. So we'll do something basic. Here's what a Lego looks like in real size. Here's what the commercial makes it look like. Is that an accurate depiction of how big the Lego set is going to be when the kid gets that and brings it home? No, it's not. If there's a cereal commercial and it's a pile of sugar with an orange and a glass of milk next to it, is it part of a healthy breakfast, right? Just those kind of basic things to help them understand how the messaging is being manipulated and kind of normalized in that way. And then we step into other things, right? So I use a lot from Stanford has a really nice civic online reasoning website. And it's also a Think Like a Historian website. We take a lot of things to help them just know how to analyze primary sources. And it's really not so much about the right answer, it's the reasoning applied to their answer. And really just helping them understand that again, it's your logic, it's your interpretation. And that there's a certain expectation of evidence. What is your evidence? Anecdotes are not evidence. Show me what you have. Help me, walk me through why you're arguing this. And what does that argument do? And so we also think about it in terms of the content information, but also in terms of the lens that they apply to their future students, in terms of misinformation. Many of them, for example, may believe that if someone is a low-income family, they don't care about their children's schooling or they're not involved. Helping them to understand that that is a deficit framework, right? And providing all the data, again, how do they have evidence for that or not? So I try and hit those different domains based on my prior experiences as an instructor, based on the kind of typical gaps in knowledge that students demonstrate, and also based on my understanding of what my learning goals are for them in my content area, in my discipline, and in their future professions. And so as I'm kind of grappling with all of the different dynamics, some of it is formally built into the class. Some of it will happen in the moment, interrupting a particular problematic statement. But what I try to do is front load all the skills and the theoretical frameworks early, and then we can keep referring back to it as we move through. And it's not a surprise. And it helps them already have the tools for when we have those intervening moments. And then it's not so difficult to address in class.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristen. We'll go over to Lisa now.
So I teach African American history, and one of the things that I run into are particular tropes and stereotypes that are part of the commodification and the memification, as I call it, of history. And I address these things. They're often steeped in misinformation in two ways. One is preventative, and that is largely, I know what the sort of white supremacist, racist tropes are. African descendant persons don't feel pain. They don't have the same intellectual ability. They're one of the reasons for a majority of the crime. There's this belief that Black slave ownership is the reason why slavery becomes embedded in American society. I know what these tropes are. I explicitly name them in lecture and identify them as here's why these things exist. And more often than not, it's students passing a meme of a neat thing that they've learned in history without really engaging with what that meme or tidbit or fascinating discussion addresses. And the other is what I call an SOCC, primary source activity. SOCC stands for Source, Observe, Contextualize, Corroborate, in which students are given primary source documents from a variety of different positions, sort of going along with the logic and the evidence that explicitly addresses and accommodates a lot of these stereotypes. very similarly to what Kristen does in her classroom. My biggest example is the post-Reconstruction Black codes. So they read enslaved codes, they read Black codes. Students largely point out that there's no difference other than the word slave is replaced with the word Black. Then they're given a document that justifies the code. Then they are given documents that argue against the code. And it has, naturally, they'll go through, identify who's the audience, but the big conversation is purpose. Why are these documents being passed? What is the accomplishment? What is it trying to legislate? And that naturally feeds into a conversation of what tropes are embedded in these legal structures and the justification for these things. Because I need students to, again, have, like Kristen has mentioned, distance. It is often a means to address the audience of my class. Majority white. I do have BIPOC students in the class, but there tends to be only a handful. And I'm very cognizant of the fact that I am non-white, presenting information that is often uncomfortable because most don't know what Reconstruction is and did. And then two, to then see how deeply embedded these tropes are, and the longer history means that there's some level of discomfort. And I want to make sure that these non-white students are not holding the bulk of the intellectual labor. So that's the other method, and it repeats every week. They do the same activity with a different set of sources over and over and over again to get to the logic and to repeat it. One, it helps them build this skill of historic thinking. And two, it's the overall goal is to see if they can trace these longer tropes and stereotypes and longstanding issues around belonging and citizenship that are embedded in the course, which is one of the sort of course outcomes. My largest problem with that is I am doing a lot of the intellectual labor and framing of that. And controlling sort of their source space, controlling the content. They don't have a textbook, I provide a lecture, and how to, as a means to prevent these sort of assumptions being spoken aloud in small group work. But so far, that is how I have found sort of success.
Thanks so much, Lisa. JP, it's your turn.
Thank you. Like Lisa and Kristen, my approach is primarily more of a framework than an intervention. And like both Kristen and Lisa, my strategy deals with sort of challenging these sort of meta narratives that are out there in the world, and thinking about the urban legends about Native people and just plain false and misleading information. And so in my course, First Nation Studies 225, Intro to the Travel World, I do a prior knowledge activity on the second day of class that uses this metaphor of mental filing folder and mental filing cabinet. We're talking schema theory, but I don't get into that. And so what I have them do is engage in an inquiry in a small group that I frame as we're doing qualitative research together on our own prior opportunities to learn. And so the first thing we do is our data collection. They get 1 minute in their group to brainstorm everything they've learned about Native people. What you know or what you know is out there, ready to go. After that, I have them spend about 5 minutes and match up with a specific source. So we're talking about how did these things that we encounter in our world get into our mental filing folder and our mental filing system? But what's the source for these things that we're accumulating in an unexamined way as we go about our life? And so because it focuses on their own prior learning opportunities and experiences, there's no need to own or defend any of it. It's what they've had the opportunity to learn to date. So once we've done that data collection, I have them code their data. All right, so the first thing they do is they look at their what they know, and I have them think about what's an assertion of fact. Right, and I don't call it a fact, I call it an assertion of fact because I'm very intentionally wanting them to think about, how do we test ideas? And if it's subject to scrutiny, does it hold? And then I have them mark things about belief, value, or opinion. Within our how column, is this a scholarly academic source? Is this something that we can trust as expertise when it comes to what the claim is? Does this come from indigenous knowledge? Is this personal knowledge or experience? And so code that accordingly. When we're considering them together as a what and a how, I ask them to identify whose perspective might that idea represent, or might that source represent. And what I found when we do that coding, when we do that tally, it's anywhere from about 3 times to 17 times as often as non-native voices are who they've encountered in learning about Native people. And so as I teach them exclusively Native voices, then we're rebalancing that. And it's not saying one is inherently better than the other. One is saying these are voices and perspectives that you've not had the opportunity to encounter in your education to date. So then we compare their experiences and what they're found to some existing research. And what they find is they're pretty much in line with what the research shows in terms of their level of understanding and their opportunity to learn. What this allows me to do is, by setting this framework, by setting this expectation of inquiry, by framing it as research into prior opportunities to learn, I don't have to directly challenge anybody at first. Right? We're just getting to know each other. We're building those relationships. And so what this approach does is it lays the groundwork for questions about content, about sources, about perspectives. And it really normalizes me asking students, and more importantly, students asking each other, where did you learn that? Where does that idea come from? Whose views does that particular idea serve in this context? And so in doing that, I also bring in some things from the Foundation for Critical Thinking. And we really get into, how do we analyze these different articles that we're reading? How do we think about questions of evidence, questions of perspective? And again, it really normalizes the process of inquiry in the classroom, that we're constructing knowledge together as we are encountering and evaluating information in an ongoing way. So that's kind of the basics of my strategy in FNS 225.
Thanks, JP. All right, Brian, you're up next.
Yeah, first of all, I would just like to say that I've already learned a great deal. Some of the things that I'm looking to incorporate in what I already do. I love some of what JP especially had to share in terms of specific strategies. So let me just start by saying a lot of what I do is science specific, public health specific, obviously. One of the strategies that I am intentional about is making students feel comfortable, because I really view these as conversations, not as we have an adversarial relationship. And I think part of the way I do that as well is I'm very honest about my own health history. And I think what that does, or what I'd like to think does for students, is that they realize how serious that I take these conversations, how important it is, because I just share my history with leukemia and relapsing and bone marrow transplantation, having a very poor prognosis. That was 37 years ago. So that was the start of my path into learning more about the immunology and microbiology that affected me, and, you know, the whole 9 yards. But so in a way, you know, I've sort of a built-in device, I think, which may get their attention, and then they're interested in learning more, and maybe they're a little more receptive, perhaps. But I'd love to even analyze that, really assess that. You know, is that true? To what extent is that true? But nevertheless, I do those kinds of things. I think Preston mentioned acknowledging especially in public health, I certainly understand where these myths and misconceptions come from. And I think that's another part of trying to make a group of people or individuals feel more comfortable, that it isn't an adversarial relationship. I'm not here to tell you that this is the way it is and you just need to listen to what I say. Because I think a lot of the basis for many of the misconceptions I hear, Stephen Colbert, I think, with truthiness, right? When he was on the Jon Stewart show, right? And I think that's part of the reason why these are so challenging. It almost seems like there could be some logic to it. So we have those kinds of conversations, and that kind of language is used. One of the things I do is to talk about what science does and what it doesn't do. And one of the great strengths of science is that it doesn't care what I believe. You know, that's Brian Merkel. And I'll use specific examples of certain things I wish were true, and then I use and take students through the scientific method that shows that it's the true strength of that process. And a great example would be that's talked about more, I think, because of COVID-19. Because of all the misconceptions surrounding that problem, whether it's vaccines, therapeutics, what have you. We talk about double-blind studies. That's a great example of a very specific strategy that scientists use to try to remove bias, feelings, all those kinds of things from both groups that are participating in a study, right? There's coded studies, it's randomized, all those kinds of things. So we talk about that as well. We also talk about social media, the internet. We talk about algorithms and how they work. We talk about some of the consequences, especially I think that loom large, that we all understand when it comes to public health and science. COVID-19, unfortunately, is a terrible teacher in this way. Because I think one of the things we recognize with all this, we have to make it worthwhile to our students or those that we're having these conversations with, why these conversations are important. And when it comes to public health, some of the obvious things, of course, we talk about morbidity, we talk about mortality, loss of life, but then we even talk about economics as well. Disease is extremely expensive. So there's a lot of different ways that we can talk about why this matters to everyone. All right, there's a COVID video series, explaining the why is behind it. So I think that's important for me. It's very intentional that it's not just here that, this is the great process and this is the right way to do things and you just need to do it this way. It's always trying to explain the logic for why we're having conversations and why these things become important. So respecting the position of everybody you're having that conversation with. And then empowering them is an important part too. A lot of individuals that I talk to, wherever they're coming from, they really want to help. They want to understand. And I think they're very frustrated. Scientific literacy, it has to be accessible to people. And historically, that's been a problem in science. There's a lot of language issues, barriers, challenges that can be off-putting, quite frankly, I think, for people.
I'm gonna cut you off there, Brian. Sorry, went a little bit over. But
oh yeah, no, yeah, thank you. Sorry about that.
No worries. But all of that was really good. Thank you so much for sharing. Valerie, you're up next.
Yeah, I want to echo what Brian had said. It's really fascinating and wonderful to be able to hear the different techniques and approaches that all of you bring to your classrooms. It's really an honor to be a part of this panel. I want to echo, I guess, really what everybody else has said, and thinking about information and where information comes from in terms of prior knowledge as well as theoretical frameworks, and understanding that our students come to us with a variety of different ways that they understand the world and the way that the world has been explained to them, right? And so I teach literature courses. for a large part of my career, I also taught composition, and there's a vast difference between students that take composition and those that take literature courses, because the ones that take lit are really excited and they're like, yeah, let's do this, and they self-select, whereas composition, they don't love it, right? I always teach social justice as the framework and foundation of all of my courses. So for example, I was teaching about rape culture in my composition classes, and using that as a way to get into rhetorical analysis. So how do you do that? Well, I started with a theoretical framework of systems of privilege and oppression, and taking it from the individual and turning it into the systemic, and trying to understand the way that information is constructed, and social construction of gender. And there's just so many things that you have to get into when you are going to be trying to show a whole new world to students, recognizing that a lot of them have no idea what this is, and it can be really scary because it's totally shaking the foundation of everything that they have understood and everything that they have known. One of the things that I try to do is sort of what JP does, where I have the ability to say, okay, well, what is Irish literature, or what is multicultural literature? What does that mean? And so that we can get all of those prior knowledge ideas out on the table first, and we can walk through those. I tend to go back to what people had said in the beginning throughout the whole course of the class, because everything that I try to be teaching is evidence-based, and I want them to be able to see that the concepts that I come up with aren't like namby-pamby, I'm an English professor and I just love nature and I love everything. No, like there is real evidence for the things that I'm teaching you, and the narratives that we're reading are the personal effects of systemic oppression, because I tend to teach courses where people have been dealing with trauma or where people are in marginalized positions. And so first they have to understand that this is not representative of every single person that's within that group, that this is a voice that is within that group. However, that doesn't negate the importance of that voice, right? And if we're trying to understand that literature is a representation of the human experience, then we have to be thinking mindfully about where does that human experience come from, which is the systemic foundation, right? And so the skills that I try to impart to my students are critical thinking, critical reading, information literacy. So it's essential that they're able to look at sources with the eye of even a scientist, right? Like, where is this coming from? And how do we know that this is reputable? And how do you test it? And what are the ways that we can think about the application? And what is the time period? And what is the dating? All of those things. It's really important. I can tell you that I've had situations where I have had students tell me, I don't care if you have evidence, I don't have time to read it. I don't care what you have to say about any of this, because in my belief system, I shouldn't even have a woman teacher, because women should be subservient to men. So we have this really interesting ability to turn things into learning moments, right? Take all of the emotional that you might feel and then think about it in terms of reason and logic, right? So and understanding that they're here because they want to learn and that they want to embrace new concepts, even if those concepts can be scary. And how do you make sure that you are providing them with the framework and the tools that they need in order to grasp what they need at the time that they can understand, right? Because I think one of the problems that can be frustrating is, like, you could say, I'm giving you everything, why aren't you learning it? Well, people learn at different speeds, right? And they learn what they're able to learn at the time. And so one of the things that I like to think about is even if I can move the needle a hair, I'm doing it, right? Like that's I can get them to one level, and then maybe JP can get them to another level, and Kristen can get them to another level, and Brian will get them to another level, right? And it is never about teaching them how to think or what to think, but how to think, right? Thinking abstractly and thinking in terms of multiplicity instead of black and white. I'm probably over my time, but I think the other thing that had been said about belonging is so important as well, because if you have a safe space for students where they feel that they can venture their opinions, then they're going to be more ready to learn, right? And more open to taking on things that might be a little threatening to them at the beginning.
Thanks so much, Valerie. All right, and now we go over to Jessica.
Hi, everyone. I've loved listening to you so far. This is just great. So I'm going to talk about my environmental science class. Two of the major kind of course outcomes for this class are, number one, understanding how energy and matter move through ecosystems, and then understanding how humans alter those movements and the consequences of that alteration. So just based on that, a lot of you might guess I'm about to talk about climate change. You are right. So when I first started teaching this class, misconceptions came out a lot more openly. So I'm going to kind of talk to you how I addressed those kind of in the heat of the moment, and I'm going to talk to you about the changes I made moving forward. So when students kind of openly share misinformation in the classroom, it can be kind of shocking sometimes, right? A lot of these things I've never heard of, kind of like Val was saying, it's because we all bring different experiences and we have been exposed to different sources of information, or I think JP said it like this, different assertions of fact, right? So the first thing I like to do is I just ask questions. I ask open-ended questions to clarify what the student is saying and to bring out, any evidence they might have to support that claim, and then to consider kind of assumptions that the student is making by asserting that fact. So this process of just open-ended questions back and forth between instructor and student is sometimes called Socratic questioning or the Socratic method. You can use it to teach whole courses, whole lectures, but I, generally just use it when misinformation is shared. So what it will look like is, oh, Dr. Warwick, volcanoes cause climate change, not people. Like, oh, okay. How do they do that? Do you know? Can you give me a little explanation of how that might work? Most of the time it's like, well, I don't really know. I heard this person, say it. So, okay. Can you tell me about that person? Who are they? How did they learn about that likely? So pretty rapidly, you can get to the point where students are probably going to say, I don't know, or I'm not sure, that doesn't really make sense. So normally in class, just 2 or 3 questions and students start thinking about and reflecting, oh yeah, maybe I don't really know anything about this. That's your opportunity. And what I do, I guess, to take advantage of this situation is I just explain, this is a really complex topic and not many people have had an opportunity to learn about this, So then I ask the student, would you like to learn, how volcanoes affect the atmosphere? And generally they're like, yeah. So if I don't already have that content kind of built in with class, I add it in, make a point to add it in, and we talk about, yes, volcanoes do affect the atmosphere. That's true, but it does not mean that humans don't as well. And we talk about, why, why that is. So that's kind of the first thing I do, but I believe Lisa and Preston and Brian kind of brought this up. If at any point while you're asking these questions, students appear to be really, really uncomfortable, I generally always just stop and I ask them, I'm happy to talk with you about this after class, because I don't want them to ever feel like I am their opponent. I'm just their teacher. I want them to maintain their kind of sense of approachability. I want them to be still invested in this conversation and not get an emotional response. So whatever you can do, I think, to make sure you aren't responding in an emotional way, I think is really helpful. After kind of these few encounters I had, I changed a few things though, and I've seen less kind of open and competent sharing of misinformation. So the first thing I did is something Kristen mentioned. I very strategically have scaffolded the content they need to know to understand climate change into the class in tiny pieces. So they learn about molecules, they learn about how bonds between molecules store energy, they learn about the carbon cycle, they learn about the atmosphere. So they are building their understanding of climate change before I've even said the word climate change. And when I bring it all together, I really don't get much open misinformation. That doesn't mean that people still don't, believe in that or have questions about it. So what I do now is I always provide an opportunity for students to anonymously ask questions. Right now, I use this kind of web app. It's called Padlet, and it allows you for free to make kind of an anonymous discussion board online. It also allows you to filter it if you want to, but I use that. You could also just pass out note cards and tell students, don't write your names on this, but you can write questions here so I can address them. And then, yeah, one more thing, and then I'm done, I promise. When possible, I think Brian explained this, is especially in science, we are, I think, kind of lucky to have less diffuse misinformation. It's sometimes easier to pinpoint where this stuff came from. So when you can, I think it's really important to talk about, where did climate denial really begin? Who did it come from? Who is really important in this? Because then you can ask students, why would this person do this? And that leads to a really kind of interesting discussion usually. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. That was great. I loved hearing everything that you all had to say, and we just have such a great group of instructors here. We do have a little bit of time left for audience questions. So I don't know, Kate, did we get any questions in the Q&A? We can start with people that are joining us remotely.
I don't have anything in Q&A, but there were a couple of things in the chat that I would like to share if you don't have your chat panel open. Somebody said, as somebody who teaches pseudoscience and scientific literacy, I make as much information as possible. I make as much information as accessible as possible. But how do we move past making scientific information not only accessible, but attractive to learn and to understand? So I'm not sure if we are using that as a rhetorical question or if you might like to respond to it. I can give you time if you would like.
I can respond quickly. So I think that as much as possible, it's important to kind of ask your students what they want to know about. So something I do at the beginning of the semester is I have students take a little survey where they kind of let me know anything they might want to about themselves. But I also ask them, what do you expect to learn in this class and what would you like to learn in this class? So I try to make sure that students are invested in that way because they kind of help me design the class.
I can add a few comments too. Yeah, so thanks, Jessica. Again, think some of the challenges that I really appreciate that comment in the chat. It can be very off-fitting. It's almost like a foreign language. And so one of the things, primary articles are important. Of course, they have their place, but so do review articles. So do vetted websites. And oftentimes what I recommend to students is to start with some good review articles. And I will list in courses like Human Disease and Society, even in 400 level classes, you get into some articles and the language it's really PhD level information or language, and it's very hard to decipher through. So I'll recommend good review journals that apply to the subject in the classes that I'm teaching. And then vetted websites where they can feel comfortable that they are retrieving accurate information.
Thanks, Brian. Kristen?
I also try to, building on what was already said, I also try to make it relevant just in terms of pointing out how it will apply in the classroom that they're going to be a part of, or just other ways that it's relevant and connects up. So one of the things we did was before Thanksgiving, I had them do fact checking, but we did it with Google search of typical Thanksgiving lessons that teachers roll out. And then I wanted them to evaluate and see whether they should actually be using that or not. And so what I'm trying to do is be realistic that many of them are going to use things like Pinterest or Teachers Pay Teachers or those kind of things to crowdsource their lessons. But I want them to be wise consumers of media and understand that just because it's from a Scholastic website doesn't mean you should roll it out in your classroom. So what I try to do is just point out this is a skill that will make your life easier if you have it. And I also will do some things to point out that they don't currently have it. So I'll just ask them some questions. It's similar to what JP does actually, where I'll have them take a piece of paper, draw a line down it, and put modern historical. And I'll say, name any famous Native American person and fill the column. You have 2 minutes. And typically the contemporary part will be empty. And then the historical one, there'll be like Geronimo. And so then we just talk about what that means as a teacher, that this prior learning opportunity for you, right? And so as you're vetting your Thanksgiving lesson plans, or you're looking at all these other things that you want to do, here are strategies for you to overcome that gap, take ownership over it. And then just to wrap it up, because I'm being super long, I'm sorry. But really what I want to avoid is me thinking that I can plug all the content knowledge holes that they have, because I can't. What I need to do is teach them how to be lifelong learners and to engage information wisely. And I want to model that for them as we're having those moments.
I just wanted to check really quick and see, do we have any questions from our in-person attendees? Kelsey, is there?
Yeah, it doesn't look like we have any questions on this end.
Okay, we'll jump back over to questions from chat then. If you want to read any more that we have, Kate.
Not really any questions aside from accolades and people wanting JP's framework. So maybe we can make a guide. And I think other people are really appreciating the Padlet idea. Great work, Jessica. I also have used it. It's pretty cool. Yeah. I think we have time for more questions if anybody has them. Of the panelists, I know you all were interested in perhaps talking about strategies, but if you would like to do that in the chat, you can too.
So one thing I forgot to kind of touch on, also because I went over time, is just I'm kind of lucky in that, you know, the misinformation I encounter in my classes, specifically in environmental science, isn't, you know, potentially like dangerous. You know, some of the stuff that you all are combating really can be, frankly, like dangerous, personally dangerous, right? And I just want to point out that I am very lucky in that our material largely will make students really uncomfortable. And that's kind of why I approach it as I do. You know, I would address it in different ways if I was dealing with different misinformation. So.
And since we have a little time too, I'd like to be on record to say, and I deal with a lot of therapy experts because I'm the president-elect of the Financial Therapy Association. So many frameworks in the mental health and therapy professions and the like, a lot of frameworks. And I've been through therapy myself. And one of them is enabling. And what we tend to forget sometimes is that even though there's misinformation out there and we need to acknowledge and provide safe spaces and hear individuals out and the like, we cannot enable misinformation. That's a must, and we cannot do that. So after we make our way through these frameworks and these opportunities to hear individuals out, it's a must that misinformation must come to an end at some point. Enabling is destructive. So at some point, it is okay to say that's not true, and then to go meet me after class, or let's step outside, or let's stop this calmly, say it calmly and respectfully, but to stop that, after these frameworks or these safe spaces or these exercises have run its course, because enabling is destructive, and that's theory as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate Preston's comments. And of course, once again, I go back to my experiences, right? So, we could easily segue that into vaccine mandates and mask mandates and those kinds of things, because certainly as scientists, we know how efficacious and how safe these vaccines are. So then the question becomes, given Preston's comments, then to what extent are we enabling? By, we've heard enough. This is not, it's just an interesting, I think, segue for me, just listening to that, and then how you would apply it in a situation that is literally costing people their lives.
Thank you, Brian. Lisa, I saw you had your mic off, so go ahead.
Yeah, so two things. One, I kind of wanted to respond to Preston, and there's a question in the chat I think I am particularly suited to answer. That's actually why I started naming these tropes as tropes rooted in white supremacy. Because by not calling it what it was and sort of hedging, because I was concerned about my own safety, I am non-white, I'm in a majority white room, I've only ever taught at predominantly white institutions, I'm very visually non-white, that puts a particular spotlight on me. And as I present this context that I am particularly aware of. But I realized in not naming why the trope existed, was doing a disservice to students, and to then say, like, this is why it's embedded. And there's no other real reason other than it is rooted in these oppressive white systemic issues, but we consider them largely as assumed fact. Why is that? However, it is particularly stressful associated with constantly doing this in every iteration of classes that I teach. I teach both lower and upper level African American history courses. I am non-white, I'm at a predominantly white institution, and I live in a predominantly white city. Okay, so there is a lot embedded in that, and I do a lot of emotional labor to sort of mitigate the audience responses, which means I burn out really fast several times throughout the semester. I have not been successful at managing the stress level of constantly teaching challenges and also helping students negotiate and navigate a lot of these longer histories of these systemic, oppressions that are coming to forefront with the Black Lives Matter movement and all these conversations around curriculum. So therapy, and then taking breaks and doing things that make you happy, and making sure that there's 1 day or 2 days a week that you're not thinking about this. I'm a big fan of Marvel movies. I knit. I've knit in class a couple of times, and I will explain, I'm frazzled. I need this right now to negotiate. And that also helps, particularly in upper level courses, students to see that, like, this is hard and it's okay even after so many years of me doing this. Like, I can say, this is hard. It's very tough to work through. It's okay if you also need a break. You don't have to keep pushing. Step outside, take a deep breath, and we're going to go back to the work. On that note, though, I do have to leave to go teach. So I just wanted to say thank you very much for this panel and for my participation in it. I've learned a great deal. But have a good day, everyone.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Lisa.
Lisa. Yeah.
I just wanted to read the question from the chat quick for the recording. So Lisa was responding to a question from the chat that said, what advice would you have for instructors about handling stress associated with teaching challenging topics on a regular basis? Thank you, Lisa.
And then I just wanted to jump in. I do see that we have several hands raised, but we're actually already at time. So thank you all that attended. Thank you to all of our panelists for contributing your valuable perspectives. And thank you to everyone that coordinated this conference. We really appreciate all of your time and labor that took to organize all of this. So yeah, thanks for attending. Thanks for participating.
We need more.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.